Early spoiler. What is up, wrestling fans? Two Bros Wrestling Show coming to you live and in living color and without a pay-per-view review for you tonight. Kevin, what's happening, brother?
The sun's still shining, Doug. I'm not used to doing these shows when there's actually daylight streaming in through this window.
I got a little bit of natural light in this room myself, so it doesn't feel right.
We're going to need that sunlight to lighten what is a little bit darker topic than we normally get into. But tonight, our main event topic, since we're not doing pay-per-view review, we are discussing the very complicated legacy of Chris Benoit. This month marks the 14th anniversary, believe it or not, of the Benoit family murder-suicides, which undoubtedly was the darkest day in the history of professional wrestling. And so tonight we are going to discuss that the events of that evening, how things have changed over the last 14 years, and how Chris Benoit is viewed in the world of professional wrestling and or not spoken of in the world of professional wrestling, and how to perhaps separate the art from the artist, or even if you should. All of that in our main event segment, Doug. But first, we have some news.
News. Oh, wait a minute. Let me see. I'm not on my normal machine, so I'm a little bit backwards here. Banners. Opening bell. There we go. Yes.
Got your sound effects and all.
Right.
Opening bell time. Glorious day. Peacock has finally come to the Amazon Fire family. Folks, this is great news for Doug and I. Perhaps it's not as big for you if you're not a Amazon-centric family. I know for myself, I have been watching WWE programming, network programming on a secondary device through my PlayStation. Doug, you've had it even rougher, haven't you?
I've been watching on my little 13-inch MacBook Pro from, I think this is a 2014 model MacBook Pro. So I've watched everything on this, where I'm used to watching everything on the WWE network on my 42-inch flat screen in our TV room. So that was quite the downgrade for me from going from network to Peacock.
So I had it nowhere near that. I was watching on the same size screen, but even with that, having to switch from the device I normally use, input over to the PlayStation, obviously not a big deal, but not being able to go around the house and watch where I wanted, when I wanted, I found myself, other than pay-per-views and those sorts of things, just in general, watching less network programming just because it wasn't nearly as convenient. So it's been more than a year, in fact, that NBC Universal Peacock has been on the market. And almost 3 months since the WWE Network was absorbed into the Peacock app. And so this is huge news going into SummerSlam. Later on this summer, here in about 4 or 5 more weeks, Doug, we're going to do a show at the 6-month mark of WWE Network being on Peacock, and giving the pros and cons to the folks out there of what we think and what they promised, what they did or did not deliver on. This was going to be by far X number one on the fail list if this was not resolved by the time we did that show. So not that there's still not problems, but this is the biggest negative that Peacock had going for, and thank goodness it has been resolved.
Yes, this is good news. Good news.
And in not so good news, folks, this this is the if you think it's Groundhog Day, no, this is a new episode of the Two Bros Wrestling Show with this next news story. I know it's going to sound like a repeat, but Doug, once again, budget cuts and or house cleaning, depending on how you look at it, has hit the WWE, and it appears that this is just an ongoing thing for the time being. We've got another round of layoffs to report. Friday, WWE released 14 talents, including Fandango, Tyler Breeze, Killian Dane, Marina Shafir, Everrise, the tag team Everrise, Arturo Ruas, Tony Nese, Arya Davari, the Bollywood Boys, Tino Sabatelli, August Gray, and Kurt Stallion. And as you can see, these are not quite the marquee names that we've seen in the last several rounds of cuts, but This has particularly, though, decimated the 205 Live brand, a show that sprang up after the very, very popular, successful 2016 Cruiserweight Classic on the WWE Network. And it continued, 205 Live did, to very quietly, and oftentimes the case, produce some of the best in-ring work that was being done in WWE, even though very few people appeared to be watching. So what happens to the purple brand after this is anyone's guess. But, as far as anyone's guess, Doug, is there anybody on this list of talent that you see having a happy home somewhere else? I know we've talked about that with prior releases. To me, this batch seems a little more difficult to predict.
I think a lot of these people are going to do fine on the indies and make a name for themselves. And, some of these names will probably show back up in WWE, maybe in Japan or other promotions at some time in the future. But, I just want to touch on 205 Live real quick. Now 205 Live, the entire roster is, 5 people?
Yes.
There's 5 people, and one of those is Brian Kendrick, or the Brian Kendrick, who's also a producer. So really, 205 is essentially 4 talents now.
Which is sad because they very much had at the beginnings a roster to be envied. It really was an indie wrestling roster, as they really had accumulated at the start of this. Probably the best cruiserweights that you could find out on the indie scene at the time. This list of folks that were cut includes a lot of folks that date all the way back to the 205 Live days when they first sprang up. When you're talking about a Davari, for example, or the Bollywood Boys, Tony Nese. I mean, Tony Nese was never given. Every time he went out there, he wrestled as if he was, on pay-per-view, even if he knew he was never going to do anything but job on 205 Live. That guy was way more talented than he ever got the chance to show. So I agree with you. I think really the indie scene is probably where most of these folks will end up. I know, we've had some big names on the last bunch of releases with, your Braun Strowmans and the Andrades and the like. There's not nearly the same high profile. The highest profile here obviously would be a Fandango or a Tyler Breeze. I don't know if either of those talents, no knock on either of those men, very talented men. I don't know if at this point in their careers, at their age, if they're going to move the needle, if they go anywhere else. I could see them maybe catching on at an Impact or something like that. But for the most part, I mean, Fandango's been there 15 years, which is hard to believe, but that's a 15-year WWE career, which is actually a pretty long time to last in the cutthroat world of world wrestling entertainment. So who knows? It might be time for him and Tyler, they might instead decide to go into the next phase of their lives and, wrestle on weekends or do conventions or make money off the name, because
Right.
Going on 40 years old and 15 years of bumps and such they might be ready to look at what comes next.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like WWE's with this latest batch of cuts is getting rid of all their smaller and older guys as they try and make room for their bigger, younger guys. I think I think we're going to see a push for a bigger, younger. And, I think some of those 205 names kind of got scooped up maybe during that whole grab all the toys you can and stick them in your toy box and do nothing with them phase. And there are probably some bigger contracts out there that the folks weren't getting. It's not a standard contract now. So in an effort to cut those corners, let's go ahead and future endeavor those higher paid athletes. So I don't know.
Dave Meltzer is reporting that even though these cuts are happening, that apparently there is also a push to hire available talent that might fit exactly what you were talking about, under 26 and over 220.
That's it, yeah.
Which goes back to the very, very core of like the 70s through the 80s and most of the early 90s. Vince McMahon thought of bigger is better. So it probably isn't a good sign for cruiserweight wrestling in WWE that is occurring. And if I was NXT UK, I'd be if I was an underutilized talent on NXT UK, I'd be worried because we've seen cuts now with the 205 Live brand being decimated after
Right.
having first seen NXT do their cuts, and then of course the main roster releasing some very surprising names from both Raw and SmackDown. The only one not yet touched is the British brand, and if you're looking at what they're doing house wide, you have to sort of feel like there's a target on your back.
Yes. Yep. Yep. It's probably time to swing that axe in NXT UK.
And from the from those being let go to those possibly returning. While promoting the latest Fast and the Furious film, John Cena confirmed on the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon the other night, when asked very directly if he was done wrestling or if he would soon be returning to a ring in WWE, and he confirmed that he will be returning to WWE. He had not wrestled his final match. Of course, this comes on the heels of Cena posting on his social media accounts back in May the WWE logo without any context or wording or any indication as to what he means, which was, of course, fueling speculation that he was getting ready to return. Obviously, when you say that I haven't wrestled my last match, that could mean I'm showing up 5 years from now, or I don't want to say I'm done. But combined with the other thing, it does have people speculating that is this a possible one-off match at SummerSlam. Obviously, Cena is busy this summer promoting both F9 as well as the upcoming Suicide Squad film, amongst other movies. But those obviously are two franchises that are pretty big time moneymakers and big opportunities for him in Hollywood. Of course, if it is a one-off where you come back and you wrestle a tribal chief or something along those lines for a big payday, it wouldn't be a bad platform in which to also promote all those movies that you have going on as well.
And I also think that Cena has at the very least a mini series with his Suicide Squad character that's spinning off into the DC universe, cinematic universe, whatever it's called, maybe through HBO Max. That we'll be seeing that. But I think Peacemaker, is that the character Peacemaker? Yeah, I think that's getting a maybe six series run. I'm not sure if it's miniseries or if we'll look at other things. So he's got plenty on his plate right now. But I'm looking forward to seeing him do the job for the tribal chief and continuing that.
If we end up having the Lesnar match that everyone's expecting, you have to have a high-profile opponent for Lesnar, and obviously a returning 16-time world champion of the League of a John Cena. It would be interesting, though, in front of a live crowd to see who the fan boos in that scenario.
Yes.
Of course, the crowd just booing both men out of a stadium could be entertainment in and of itself.
It's happened before.
It has happened before. In other news, Doug, the newest member of the Raw creative team is also now a former member of the Raw creative team. In an interview shortly after being hired, WWE Raw writer Kenneth Mobley admitted that when she was hired, she was not required to know anything about pro wrestling. In fact, she proved it while calling Bobby Lashley in this very same interview Bobby Ashley. So,
in her defense, she almost got the name right. She said it was Lashley or maybe Ashley. She wasn't sure.
Understandably, WWE was not exactly thrilled with her providing this interview and that tidbit of information. Fightful reported that this was directly the reason and why she had been already let go from the company, direct results of these comments. Supposedly, WWE brass were furious, and this is a quote from the article. The interview made them look, quote, blindingly stupid.
Wow. All anybody's going to do is watch Raw on any given Monday now. But anyway.
So we hardly knew ye, Kenneth, but yes, maybe if you're a WWE writer watching this show, trying to figure out a little bit about professional wrestling, hearing Doug and I talk about it, maybe don't give an interview.
Don't do it. Don't do an interview. Don't.
Last bit of news, Doug, for tonight before we move to our main event topic, and you'll love it. AEW fans, it's a programming note. After an entire month of bouncing around from when is exactly Dynamite on this week? Why is it not in my DVR? It's been Friday nights. It's been late on Wednesday nights. It's been Saturday at 6, 7 o'clock. So this Wednesday, we see the return to Dynamite. And so instead of hearing JR goes, it's Saturday night, you know what time that is means it is? And I'm like, no, not really. Not quite some time, JR. Tell me, what does that mean? Back Wednesday night for its regular time slot, and hopefully fewer preemptions moving into the summer, especially considering we're going to make that TBS switch here in about 6-7 weeks. And hopefully once that happens, very few programming switches in its future. Let's hope.
Let's hope. Let's hope.
And that is the opening bell, the news for this week. Are we ready to talk the main event?
Man, this is heavy. Let's get into this. Let's talk the main event. Chris Benoit, the man, the myth, the legend, the pariah of professional wrestling as well.
All of the above, and that is where that is exactly where the legacy gets complicated. And before we really get into the meat of this, I mean, really, I'd like to give a disclaimer that nothing spoken today specific to wrestling is going to supersede real life and entertainment. And, I mean, we know that nothing in entertainment is going to rise to the level that we forgive anyone for what happened. And that is not the point of today's episode. We're not here to reclaim the legacy of Chris Benoit. We're here to discuss the legacy of Chris Benoit. We're not looking to even exonerate Chris Benoit or try to say why he did what he did. We're here to say that things have changed over the last 14 years and how Chris Benoit has been viewed within the wrestling industry, and as fans, how maybe we should now look at what happened, because there's only one thing you're going to think of first, Doug. And I mean, like I was thinking today, like how do we put this in like some perspective? I'm thinking, despite all the scientific cultural advancements in music and arts and science, the country of Germany would like you to remember those contributions. But when you think the country of Germany, the first thing you think of is something they'd rather you not think about. So there's no way in the world that you're ever going to mention the name Chris Benoit that this is not the first thing you're going to think about. So all that said, we're getting ready to probably say some things nice or some complimentary things about the man's talent or his time in the ring. But we wanted to first and foremost let you know that in no way is a look at, minimizing the tragedy that was there at the very end of his life. So all of that said, you can't divorce it. But let's go back, Doug, before the unthinkable. Let's put ourselves in the box in that parameter where before the unthinkable happened, the career of Chris Benoit, right? Do you remember, Doug, what you thought of Chris Benoit at the time, or when you first remember seeing Chris Benoit? Because here's a man who his career is a 22 championships across Japan, ECW, WCW, and WWE. That's a pretty big body of work before all of the other things he'll obviously be remembered for.
So I was thinking about this, and honestly, there's a lot that there's a very long history of Benoit before he ever gets to the WWE. Benoit was probably on my wrestler in WCW with whatever he had going on there. I don't really remember. I mean, the big thing for Benoit with me was when he debuted with the Radicals. One Monday he was on WCW, and the next Monday he, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and Perry Saturn were in the audience and, jumped the barricade on a Monday Night Raw. And the Radicals, a stable, and we've talked before, I love it, but, I can recognize the skill of Benoit, but I know we talk about it. I could never really get behind Benoit because there really wasn't a character, and especially at that time in the Attitude Era, you needed a character. I mean, you could be the greatest wrestler there was, but you weren't going anywhere. We had characters; they weren't booky characters or those cartoonish characters at that time, but there were still very much characters, not unlike we have today. But Benoit was a wrestler's wrestler, but no. I don't want to say no career. He was a wrestler who could have definitely been, as a wrestler, he could have definitely benefited with a hyped man or woman.
So you would tease me at the time about like my love of Chris Benoit. Yeah. So I'll just, obviously it's not a popular thing to admit now, but again, we're in the parameters of the box of where we're looking at only the before years. And during that time, when he was an active wrestler, I would have, if you'd asked me who's your favorite active wrestler, I would have said Chris Benoit. My first exposure to him probably would have been his latter day inclusion into the Four Horsemen. I wasn't watching wrestling actually at the time he first appeared in WCW, which was around 92, 93. I know we've talked here before about our fandom dating back to the 80s. And my whole life, once I became a fan, there was only like 2.5 years that I was a lapsed wrestling fan. And it was about the time I went to college and didn't have cable and got busy and just kind of fell out of it for a little while. And I missed his first run, I guess, in WCW. So I probably came back into the fold in the mid 90s, right about the time they put him in the Four Horsemen. And I'm sure rather than note his talent at the time, I probably just thought it was sacrilegious that there was anyone else in the Four Horsemen other than the original Four Horsemen. And then maybe you can make the I can make the case for Barry Windham, but after that, with Lex Luger, that's no longer the Four Horsemen. Anything after that, not the real deal. Although he very likely may have been one of the more talented members as far as just technical wrestlers to ever be in the Four Horsemen, he wasn't the Four Horsemen. So the first time I remember getting my attention to Benoit for, wow, this guy is talented, was probably in WCW when he had the Best of 7 series with Booker T, which Booker will still say is probably some of the best matches that Booker ever had. So nowadays, folks, if you ever see a best of 5 series like you saw a couple years ago that they did a storyline with Cesaro and Sheamus when they were fighting one another before they ended up begrudgingly accepting one another into a tag team, all of that is really, when you see that thing, they're replaying what Booker and Chris Benoit did. It kind of put both of them on the map. At the time, Booker was considered a tag wrestler. That made him as a singles wrestler that he would be known as for the rest of his career. And it kind of made Benoit too and put him on the radar of other organizations. Doug's right. He was not a great talker. He was not a character. And it was part of why I liked him. His intensity level that he used to make up for his lack of size and talking was, I am a wrestler from Canada, from the dungeon. He worshipped at the feet of Tom Billingsley, of the, also known better as the Dynamite Kid from the British Bulldogs. He very much had that same undersized but overly muscular body and wrestled a very similar style, incorporating a lot of those same moves. His strikes were hard. His offense was crisp. And I found the presentation that he had, the non-presentation, actually more appealing to me at the time. And that very early version of Benoit got my attention. But then, of course, he went on to WWE. And as Doug said, with the Radicals, that's where he got on even more folks' radar. He had already been a world champion in WCW, which seemed impossible because of all they had going against him with his speaking and the size. But WCW was falling apart, so they kind of offered him that title in hopes that he'd stay, and he still left. So I never in a million years expected that when he went to WWE that he would be as big as he ended up being. And Doug, I know you said you weren't the hugest of fans at the time. Did you have any memories of Benoit or matches at the time that you remembered, as maybe classic matches that were favorites of yours, or were you just so not a fan that you couldn't even get into the work?
Honestly, in hindsight, I can go back and watch matches and watch highlights, which are easier to find on. I think you can probably find them on YouTube quicker than anywhere else. Or even just watching the other talk about, like, I think there's the Vice Dark Side of the Ring. Benoit, clearly a talented wrestler, but really the only thing that sticks out in my mind, other than that debut with the Radicals, is always giving you great. I don't know why, because
you would call him Benoit, and you would.
Benoit, Jericho did that, and it just stuck. I thought it was hilarious, and that was a great pair. You had Jericho and Benoit feud. Benoit being called Benoit, and that just stuck. So,
and that latter
really, man, I don't have that banner match with Benoit. How about you?
Well,
or is it that
Chris Jericho you mentioned? That latter match they had was fantastic. Back in the ECW days, the matches he had with like a Malenko were great. Obviously, he and Eddie were magic every time they touched. He and Kurt Angle had some unbelievable matches in WWE, but if I had to pick one, it was the one I never thought would happen because again, I as someone who was about the same height and stuff as Benoit, I saw Benoit as a surrogate. Like, this is a guy that Vince McMahon won't get behind because Vince McMahon likes big guys, characters. Benoit's going to only be so big here on the card. And there was that WrestleMania main event, WrestleMania 20, triple threat, Triple H, HBK, and one of these things is not like the other, Chris Benoit. And there was no way in the world that Chris Benoit was walking out of there world champion because Vince McMahon did not see him that way. It might be, again, it's not popular to say now, but in that safe zone of trying to like separate from what became after from just that moment, it might be the biggest mark out moment I myself ever had in professional wrestling. I literally recall screaming at my television, come on, come on, come on, as the crossface was applied, because I thought there's no way, because all three men were amazing workers and the match itself was an absolute classic. And they were giving you that hope spot that I didn't think would actually happen. And then he wins the title. And then Eddie comes out having already defended the SmackDown World title earlier. And here are these two men who were literally as close as brothers. Yes.
There you go.
That one right there.
Yeah.
Both of them gone. Both of them told.
Too little. Yeah. See, until you're mentioning that, on my phone, looking at, following along with Benoit's career on Wikipedia, because again, man, I mean, back in the day, Triple H was my, favorite wrestler. That's probably a very unpopular opinion in and of itself, but I always loved it. I always gravitated towards the character who could also wrestle. I know JR put Triple H over as one of the best technical wrestlers. I mean, honestly, we're probably talking about one of the best technical wrestlers tonight. But the character just meant much, and Benoit's character, I'm still not sure the character. I think we maybe had like a Daniel Bryan moment with Benoit here. This WrestleMania you're talking about, where it's like, okay, let's push the little guys. Eddie, I'm sure had some stroke backstage at that point. Because I think Eddie, the most charismatic one of the Radicals to come out of those four jumping ship. Didn't Perry Saturn end up with a broom or something? And yes. Malenko had like a James Mick and gimmicks, except for Benoit. Benoit was, as far as I can tell, just Benoit. This angry, intense guy.
Yeah, and in retrospect, that's not a great look. To go back and think on.
Right. Right.
Yes. Which I guess it does bring us to what we have to talk about. The thing you can't get around. Again, the number one thing you're going to think of anytime you mention Chris Benoit, but it was 14 years ago, as hard as that is to believe, 14 years ago, but over a 3-day period. And again, this is I know if you're a wrestling fan, even if you weren't alive at that time, you probably know this, but in case you forgot, we won't get into the gruesome details, but over a 3-day period between June 22nd and 24th of 2007, Benoit, who was just 40 at the time, murdered his wife, Nancy, who was a character in wrestling for years, often under the stage name of Woman. He killed her and then later would kill his 7-year-old son, Daniel, before hanging himself. So I know I called it earlier the darkest day in the history of professional wrestling. I want to stand by that because I can't think of anything that would even come close to the magnitude of a triple, I guess, murder-suicide of a family that's to this day, 14 years later, still really hard to believe. I mean, just hard to believe. Doug, do it's kind of like, for non-wrestling fans, for people who just watch the news and such, where were you when Reagan was shot or Kennedy was shot or men landed on the moon? I mean, for wrestling fans, I think if you were a fan at the time, you have to remember exactly how this news washed over you. For me, I was in the kitchen for some reason. My wife was the one in the living room as Raw came on. And of course, the graphic, comes on the screen to, memorialize Chris Benoit, because at the time they weren't saying that it was a murder suicide. He had just passed away. I remember her, oh my gosh, some sort of explanation. Come here, Benoit's dead. And I hate to say it at this point, Doug, we of our generation were so used to, we'd lost Eddie and Bulldog and Rick Rude, and it's just going on on and on and on. It was not unusual for a wrestler passing early. It was actually distressingly common during that era. So of course we all just thought, what in the world has happened? What tragedy is this? Not knowing exactly just how big a tragedy it was. But were you watching that night? Do you remember your reaction?
You know what? I'm sure I was watching, but yeah, I'm trying to think because dirt sheets then weren't what they are now. I mean, now we have shows like this, and shows like What Culture Wrestling, Wrestle Talk, and there's probably 100 others. But that's news that breaks, and you can just jump on YouTube and find it. I think I may have jumped to maybe PW Torch or one of the wrestling, on websites and started combing through things, trying to find out, what actually happened here, what happened. And I have more memories of looking at sites and just digging through than actually there was a lot of heartbreaking tributes that night too that were kept popping up because everybody was very upset about just been in a situation, but more so. That is all just a blur, really, because I'm thinking I was hung up on like the Wikipedia and it being updated and then unupdated, and there was like the urban legend about Chavo Guerrero's involvement and all that, who found when and who the Wikipedia page and how that all went down. It's there was just a weird time, man.
Let's touch a little bit on what you said about the tributes, Doug, because for those who have had the details lost to them because of the 14 years in time, Benoit was supposed to wrestle on that Sunday night at a pay-per-view. There was a pay-per-view on Sunday, and as a consummate professional that he was, he never no-showed. He never was late. He always called if something went on and no one had heard from him. And it was only when it got so close to the show that WWE asked for a wellness check that the sheriff went and found the scene at the Benoit compound. So by Monday, the details were not out in the public realm, and they go on air for Monday Night Raw with the tribute to Chris Benoit show. So Monday Night Raw took the form that only one Raw previous that I ever saw took, and that was after Owen Hart passed away, where they, instead of having just straight matches, everyone stayed out of character, and you were allowed, if you wanted to, you didn't have to. If you didn't want to, you could say a few words, and obviously there were lots of tears in that very tragic, sad Owen situation. They did the same for Benoit because no one really knew exactly what happened. At first, it could have looked like a break-in or many things, but interestingly enough, right before air, and then even more so while the show was live on USA, and as it went on, details began to emerge that, wait a minute, this is not a home invasion situation. We might be memorializing the perpetrator. And WWE has taken criticism for that. Again, it's live television. What are you going to do? But during most of those heartfelt tributes, they began to get a picture as to the true story as to what happened. Doug, do you think it was an error in judgment on WWE's part to continue down that road when they chillingly might be learning right before airtime that we might be ready to go on and memorialize a murderer?
Man, live TV is a very, very difficult thing, and I don't think there's a right answer there. They did what they went with their gut. They knew the guy. They worked with the guy. So I think a lot, if not everybody on that roster at the time, was in disbelief that there's no way anybody who was even hearing that might have happened was in severe denial about it, and they went with the guy they remembered, the Canadian crippler. And I think hindsight always going to be 2020. But I think in the moment, I think they did what could do, what probably would have been done for anybody. So I have a hard time criticizing them for that. Doing that and the emotion. I do remember that. Like, wasn't it Bill? Jericho, Malenko breaking down.
Yeah.
But it's all very difficult and even to this day uncomfortable thing to talk about. Really, I mean, and I'm looking back, looking back through here, just hitting the Wikipedia about it.
It's ugly business, so it is difficult to talk about even when we schedule this program because it's been 14 years. That's why I wanted the disclaimer up front, because I didn't want it at all to look like we were making excuses for how the man ended his life and the life of two innocents. But again, looking at the career and looking at that night, I can see why one would criticize WWE and how the show must go on. If you're finding out details live, it's a tricky thing. In retrospect, it's obviously easy to criticize someone for the choices they make. At the time, you're going to obviously think that what's beginning to be heard can't possibly be true because it just seemed like there's no way in the world such horror could possibly be true. There's got to be some other explanation because you're right. This is someone they knew. The man they knew was not this man. I was out traveling this week before the show. I was out most of the week. I wished I'd had time because I wanted to look through some photos I had and was going to scan them in for tonight's broadcast because it wasn't maybe 3-4 weeks before everything happened in June of that year that WWE was in Huntington, and I had front row seats. And Benoit was, again, he was an active wrestler. I can't remember at the time if he was still my favorite. He would have still been one of my favorites. I was excited to see him, and I had all these pictures of Chris Benoit. I remember one in particular where I was in front row. He had gotten thrown into the railing, so literally I'm looking down over the railing and taking my picture of Chris Benoit and thinking, how cool is this? I'm this close to one of my favorite superstars, and how chilling it is to think that you look back at that picture and who could have ever possibly guessed that this man was about in 3 weeks time to kill his 7-year-old son and his wife and himself. It's still unbelievable. 14 years later, still unbelievable. I completely hear you about not blaming WWE for the way they reacted on that night. Let's though now talk maybe a little bit about how they reacted afterwards. For those, again, who were not watching wrestling at the time or maybe was not alive at the time, it was all that the news could discuss for days. The mainstream media cares nothing for professional wrestling unless something bad happens. And obviously, this was such a sensationalistic story. It brought up the early deaths of other wrestlers, guys like Eddie and things that the mainstream media barely touched upon previously. Suddenly, they're bringing all of this stuff up too in their daily reporting. And it provided a platform, quite honestly, for weeks for former wrestlers, including many who, quite honestly, only had access to grind, to get back in the spotlight and do the mainstream media circus tour. Do you remember anything in that aftermath, Doug, about that time that were literally this was the topic on every show you could possibly turn on?
So didn't Mark Marrow make the rounds after that? It seems like I remember him being on the news an awful lot and just kind of being everywhere after Benoit. Yeah,
that's a good call out. He was definitely one of the ones that took advantage, quite honestly, of the opportunity to be back on television again.
Yeah. I don't remember really a thing he had to say, but it seemed like that dude was everywhere after this.
And obviously, when he had been on he had lots of access to grind, and he was not. When you say he was everywhere, to be clear, he wasn't everywhere defending the sport of professional wrestling for all these early deaths or Benoit in general. But he was definitely talking about the lifestyle and how it led to the early deaths and how the companies didn't take care of each other. And none of that topic I have any problems with. He was not wrong in many of those assessments.
Right.
Though sometimes you have to look at the reasons why some people do what they do. I was thinking in particular superstar Billy Graham, who was very well known for steroid abuse in the 70s. He was in a lot of places. Of course, that was during the time he was on the outs with WWE, and depending on if he was mad at Vince or not mad at Vince would be whether or not he would be at the Hall of Fame or on TV somewhere trashing Vince McMahon. So sometimes you have to take
Right.
some of these folks with a grain of salt. But until the media got a hold of whatever the next scandal was, wrestling was under the spotlight for a long time. For a while, Doug, it was even spoken of that all of this very sensationalistic material was going to be a movie. It had
Hmm.
been pitched for a while and ended up in the form of a screenplay called Crossface, and apparently this screenplay required the permission of the Benoit family to continue. And in an interview in 2020, Chris Benoit's son, who himself has aspirations of being a professional wrestler, but just a year ago, he pretty much said that the movie is a no-go as the family rejected the screenplay. So at least for right now, there will not be a Benoit movie of any sort, but which maybe is a good thing, I guess,
Yeah.
depending on how it was done. I'm not so sure that wouldn't be just one more chance to dredge this up in a sensationalistic manner instead of looking at it in an objective manner. As for WWE, Doug, it's been a long ride as far as how they chose to handle the situation. At the time, I remember it was completely defensive. Obviously, Vince McMahon's natural pose is "it's not me, it's you" kind of arrogance,
Hmm.
and I remember, if you recall, the same that Vince at first was just very like, wrestlers are responsible for themselves. We had nothing to do with this. It's not the
Right.
lifestyle, blah, blah, blah. But they very quickly went from realizing that it was doing them no favors to comment on this to shutting out the rest of the world and going back into that WWE bubble. And
Hmm.
inside that bubble, you were not so much as to utter the name Chris Benoit. It was, if that was said on air, you can pretty well be sure you were on the unemployment line the next day. They even went so far as to at first edit out Chris Benoit from all of the archive clips in what was the precursor at the time to WWE Network, which is something they had called 24/7, which was a VOD type service, but you couldn't get Benoit matches. Then, after some time had passed, the Benoit matches came back, but with a disclaimer before the match that they would run. And then finally, as we have now in its current form, WWE Network, Benoit's material is still out there and it's in its intact form, the way that it was then, without a disclaimer. And you're just not allowed in the modern day to say anything about Chris Benoit on air. Do you think, Doug, that any of this was the right move for WWE? Did they handle that part of it in the aftermath in the correct way? Do you think that just trying to erase Benoit completely from history was right, or was it at least right for the time?
I think it was absolutely right for the time. I mean, regardless of what led to the actions are inexcusable, and uh, they had to do something. And clear, I think they did. Again, they were acting on the best information they had at the time when they did the tribute, and then they had to react once all of the information they had all of the information, and it may have been very knee jerky in hindsight. Again, there are no really good calls in any of this to make. I mean, there really aren't. You're dealing with a murder suicide here of a wife and child and one of your talents, and you're trying to navigate this in a corporate structure with, like you said, all eyes are on you now. And I think they did what they had to do at the time, and then eventually he's back into it. I mean, even with the original Nexus debuting, and Daniel Bryan,
Mm.
making choking Justin Roberts. That got Daniel Bryan kicked right out of WWE in no time flat for emulating something like that. But again, it was a sign of the times, and they had to do something. They couldn't do anything. Maybe they overcorrected, but yeah, I don't think so. I think they needed to do that, and then maybe gradually, as time went on, acknowledge what had happened. But you can't let that be your face, and because that's what it was at the time. that was becoming the face of WWE.
Should they just have left Benoit out of the history, or do you also think that it was right to eventually, after a certain amount of time, start to just quietly let it creep back into the public record?
I think it should be. I think it should creep back into public record because I mean, I hate to get all cliche, but if you think about it, if we're not remembering the past, we're doomed to repeat it. I've got my phone here up too, and I'm just looking back through, just familiarize myself with what they found with Benoit afterwards. And I mean, you have the brain of like an 85-year-old like dementia patient. That's a lot of diving headbutts and a lot of chair shots, and and let's talk about like we brought up at the beginning of the show. WWE is coming back to the land of the giants. There's 4 or 5 guys that are in 205 Live. Benoit was a man struggling in literally a land of giants. Steroids, anything he could to get over. So,
well, and that's the thing. At the time, it was blamed on everything from the roid rage is one of the first things that you saw in the sensationalistic coverage that came after. Of course, eventually, when we did find through Chris Nowinski and the work he did for traumatic brain injury, we realized that Benoit was a 40-year-old man with an Alzheimer's brain, 85. Yeah. You put those two things together, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a murderer, and it's not an excuse that there wasn't perhaps evil also in him, but you're not looking for excuses, you're looking for contributing factors, and both of those are obvious contributing factors to what ended up occurring. And, because time has passed, we're saying on air, WWE says nothing, but off air, whether it's addiction issues or not anything to do with anything other than his opponents hitting him with chairs or diving headbutts, things he did not maybe know was harming him at the time. Some of his friends have taken to, in recent years, sort of softening their public, being more brazen, I guess I should say, especially someone like a Jericho, who is no longer employed by WWE and doesn't rely on them for a paycheck. He's been probably the most open to just say, talk about Benoit matter-of-factly, talk about his career, talk about his relationship, talk about his love for him as a brother, talk about his belief that, CTE is the reason. That's why all of this happened. It was not the man that we knew. It was the man that this disease made him become, and is able to separate those things. Jericho has done this. Booker T and Kurt Angle are 2 others that have spoke positively in recent years of Benoit's work rates and the fact that he's probably one of the top 4 or 5 technical wrestlers. Angle said that he, thinks that that's the Mount Rushmore of technical wrestling. He's got to be on it, despite, some kind of controversial comments. And on the other extreme, you have big names like a John Cena or a Batista, understandably, considering their movie careers, I guess, if you think about it. But they've taken the other approach of like, no, a monster, he should be forgotten. He's an albatross to this industry for what he did. Can you separate the art from the artist? We hear that all the time. I think it's obviously harder in wrestling. I can hear Be My Baby or Billie Jean and not think of, allegations of pedophilia or murder convictions because I'm just listening to the song and trying not to think too deeply about maybe the people involved in the making of that song. When you see Chris Benoit, you see Chris Benoit. And the first thing I see when I see Chris Benoit is what happened. Is it possible, Doug, do you think, are the matches he had with Jericho, Shawn Michaels, Eddie, Regal, Mysterio, countless others, are those classics still classic? Can we watch those matches and enjoy them as classic matches, or do we first have to give ourselves the disclaimer about Benoit and then try to enjoy those matches?
For me personally, and everybody's mileage may vary, but I think it's much more difficult to do that separation when we're watching such a physical form of entertainment, because the characters are there to beat the hell out of each other. This is a very physical and violent form of entertainment, even though it's all choreographed and staged. The hits are still real, And I think it's very difficult to separate that, especially when the Benoit character is this very intense crippler.
He's a
And
crippler. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's for me, it's difficult. I mean, I don't know about you or anybody watching, but definitely for me, it's difficult to do that, and it takes a bit of a reset there for in my mind to say, okay, there are clearly other things going on with this man, but he I don't know, man. That's a hard one for me.
Yeah.
It's very hard to separate those two.
And as we've pointed out on the show, you weren't even a fan at the time in the way that
Right.
I was. So for me, I'm sitting here with Best of Chris Benoit, like DVD set that I loved at the time because it had some of the greatest matches in my collection on it. Those matches with Regal and Mysterio and just all those other undersized guys. They were doing things that you wouldn't see at that time
Mhm.
outside of Japan. I mean, quite
Right.
honestly, and I can't look at. I have not watched one of those DVDs since that day, 14 years ago. I'd like to think I could see the match. I can't say that I haven't watched him since then because sometimes on the networks I've been watching some archive stuff. It comes on and it gets my attention. But the first thing I think of is the little boy and woman, his wife Nancy there, and it takes me a while to just like try to watch the match for the match, and I don't know that I ever will. Do you have any? Now obviously, hindsight is 2020. It's hard to separate and say what ifs, but had all wrestlers, I think, want that Shawn Michaels moment, that Ric Flair moment, that glorious, like you're one of the best of all time retirements where you walk out on your own terms and everyone surrounds the ring and the fans, cheer and the wrestlers bow and that wrestling's big on nostalgia. Obviously, regardless of the talent, Benoit is never going to have that glow about him of like one of the all-time greats. Do you have any feeling whatsoever where Benoit may have slotted in on how he would have been remembered had it not been for what we will ultimately all remember him for?
Man, I don't know. That's a hard one because I think his golden moment was that WrestleMania we were talking about. I think he would probably would have been a short time champion. It would have been like a Kofi kind of thing. He would have been a short time champion, and then eventually he would have done like Malenko. Had this not happened, he would have moved into like a Malenko producer role behind the scenes, and he would have stayed in the business, but he was never going to achieve the greatness beyond that short time championship that he had, and I don't see it going on to like a Shawn Michaels or a Ric Flair. Despite his technical ability, I don't think he would have ever achieved that level. And maybe that's just my own prejudice going
No,
into it. I was never a fan, and maybe still, I have no hard time getting over somebody who actually killed their son.
I think he would have, if not been for what he did. I think he could have possibly been remembered as that under the radar wrestler's wrestler. That if you were in the know, he wasn't going to be he wasn't going to be Hulk Hogan or one of like the big personalities. But you're going to say Tiger Mask or Pegasus, or his work as the Pegasus Kid, or your Tom Billingsley types like that. Like, yeah, he was not as big as these guys, but if you want to talk the best workers of all time, he's on that short list. Go check this guy out. I think he would have been that in the know to new fans. Hey, you know where that guy got that from? Well,
Right?
go check
Yeah.
out the old matches of William Regal and Chris Benoit putting on a clinic. As far as lasting legacy goes, Doug, I guess that, as we've noted many times during this discussion, it is very complicated and it's hard to look for any silver lining in the murder suicide of three people. But if you want to look at the lasting legacy of Benoit, other than the tragic name attachment, the silver lining would be what we now know that we did not know. The after effects of this horrible stuff happening was all the research that was done that has changed the sport of professional wrestling. It took an awful thing to do it, but he not only changed the world of professional wrestling, it changed the world of football and all
Mm-hmm.
contact sports. We did not talk about CTE. All the new rules in football to stop head-on-head collisions, chair shots in the world of professional wrestling, or moves that dropped on your head. All of that is a direct result of the tragedy. It took, unfortunately, two adults and one child dying tragically for people to realize, hey, what maybe was going on here. What made someone do that? What made a 40-year-old have the brain of an 85-year-old? So I guess that is one positive that we could say is the legacy of Chris Benoit, is that the business changed because it had to change. If it had not been for that something that tragic, we all know that wrestling promoters only do things when they're absolutely pushed into doing things, and this is one of those situations they could not turn away from, and therefore there actually was changes made. But there's other, I mean, very lightly behind, all of that, there are some other lingering legacy to Benoit. Every time you see Daniel Bryan do a yes lock, which is a crossface, or that diving headbutt, that is all Chris Benoit channeling Tom Billingsley before him. They'll never call it out by name, but the work is obviously still influencing some.
And every time I see Daniel Bryan now back in the ring after his own concussion issues, doing doing anything that comes close to anything that's going to potentially cause a concussion. I know we've talked about this before. I'm cringing and so worried about it, knowing all we know now. But
it's definitely a long way from not even being able to evoke the name of Benoit to a man doing a good deal of his moveset and getting away with it. Had Daniel Bryan been in WWE 10 years ago, just a few short years after the tragedy, there's no way either of those moves would have been allowed on television. So, for better or worse, I guess at some point Tom has to start to heal those wounds, and you can't completely erase the man and pretend he never existed and pretend it never happened and pretend he isn't part of your title lineage and legacy, and that the work he did while he did it was exceptional, even if the end was again the worst day in the history of professional wrestling. And that is sort of in a nutshell the very complicated legacy that we're still dealing with today, 14 years later, as of last week. 14 years, the Benoit family murder-suicide tragedy. And folks, if you have varying opinions on this, disagree with us. I think we were too easy on Benoit. I think we were too hard on Benoit. If you have a strong opinion one way or the other, and you're watching this archive, please leave us a comment. We'd like to hear it, and we'd like to address it.
Love to hear it. But so let's wrap this up and get on to something else.
Something a little lighter. Let's talk botch. Let's talk botch of the week, Doug. How about that? Let's talk lighthearted botch instead of like real world like heavy stuff. Okay.
my botch is still a little bit of real world heavy stuff because WWE has got to stop firing people. I mean, we've talked before about the botch of the week, embarrassment of the week, big things that, we as wrestling fans have to explain to non-wrestling fans. WWE has multiple billion-dollar deals. Their Fox deal, their Peacock deal, the best, great earnings reports coming in, and they're cutting people loose. I get it. They have a bloated roster that they don't use. They bought up a lot of people and tied them up in contracts so nobody else could play with all the toys that were on the table. And now we're starting to see those toys be released because, the mindset has changed there. I think I see what's happening, but it still does not make it any better because people are losing their jobs every week. And again, let's talk about that poor girl that was just hired as a writer. That's not her fault that she knew nothing about wrestling and didn't even know the champion's name.
You're the one doing the hiring, right? Yeah. Yeah, you're the people doing the hiring. If she doesn't know the job, then don't do the hiring. Not her fault at all.
Right, but that's my watch of the week. WWE and their continued parade of pink slips.
I think at this point, and you have to stop calling that budget cuts. This is house cleaning. I mean, they're getting ready to go back on the road. They've got some really good deals, as you said, some record profits even during the COVID era. So this is probably more to do with Vince McMahon getting rid of either really expensive assets or people he doesn't see anything in, especially if it's true that he wants to go back to a bigger style of wrestler, younger. A lot of these names make a lot more sense in that light than they do as simple, well, we need to cut the budget, because you don't. You just don't. My botch of the week is a lot less serious than that, but not to me. So Hell in a Cell. The Hell in a Cells that we saw on Raw and SmackDown. If you watched our show last week, the review of Hell in a Cell, Doug and I both were curious as to why would you take Roman Reigns and Rey Mysterio and bump them to Friday night instead of having it on pay-per-view. And then, lo and behold, the next night later, 24 hours later, little did we know, we would have another Hell in a Cell match on Raw between Bobby Lashley defending the belt against Xavier Woods in a Hell in a Cell. So when Hell in a Cell was established as a gimmick in 1999, between then and the end of the Attitude Era, there were 5. And that includes the very first one, which was the classic HBK Undertaker match, and the third one, which was the even more famous Mick Foley Undertaker match. There was 5. You go into the 2000s, and then you add on the 2, the annual pay-per-views, and that's now you have one a year. And then it became 2 matches on that pay-per-view, 2 cell matches a year. And then this year, you put one on Raw and SmackDown in the 2. You had 4 in a weekend. That's too many Hell in a Cell matches. That match Monday, Doug, was the 49th Hell in a Cell match in history. 49. That's at least 30 too many, in my opinion.
Maybe somebody was on the right track with hiring somebody who knows absolutely nothing about wrestling. I mean, at this point, it really couldn't hurt WWE to have kept the girl around longer than a week.
And honestly, all 4 matches were good to great. There's nothing wrong with the matches. It's just protect the gimmick. I remember as a kid, and I know, Doug, you will too, and we're going to sound like an old man ranting here, but like Ric Flair versus Harley Race in a cage at Starrcade, I mean, that was a big deal. Yes. And then they ruined the cage match by just having so many of them. They would, you'd get a cage match on television once a week, and suddenly putting guys in the cage to settle it without outside interference just became commonplace. And I'm afraid at 49 Hell in a Cell matches, they're making Hell in a Cell commonplace, especially when you're just doing, and no offense against Woods, but Woods versus Lashley in a cell, there was no reason for that at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, bad. And my botch of the week. Performer of the week, Doug, do you have one?
Jack Perry, man. Jack Perry is on fire, man. He is tearing it up. After the last AEW pay-per-view, where I kept turning to you and saying, it's not going to happen, man. It's not going to happen. They're not giving this kid to it. I was believing when I was watching last night, maybe he has a shot. Maybe, they listen to it. I don't see how the booking works, but maybe he has a shot. Maybe this is legit. So many near falls, and I'll go ahead and spoilers. This is also my match of the week. Kenny and Jungle Jack Perry. I mean, that was great TV. I was entertained. I'm actually sitting there going, no, come on, while I'm watching the falls on that one. But kudos to Jungle Jack Perry, man.
Obviously, Kenny Omega can make you and I look good, but to go to that next level, that my wife was watching with me, and she was into it just as much as I was into it because it was such a great match. Doug is right, and that's one of those you win even when you lose. You're hanging with a triple world champion in the main event in front of a hot crowd that wants you so bad. The crowd is crazy about Jungle Boy. He is going to be such a star. It was probably hard to look like you were physically, incapacitated in defeat. He had to probably fight a smile coming on his face because he was a big winner in that match that he knew there was no way he was going to win. He was a winner in that match for sure.
Absolutely, man.
My performance of the week is Hit Row. Doug, a few months ago, you and I did a show on factions and what makes great factions and how they were starting to make a comeback, maybe not so much in WWE as elsewhere. I want to call out Hit Row. I've been wanting to for a few other times in this slot, but we've had other performances I felt I needed to talk about that were timely. But they are consistently one of the best things on NXT. You got a dominant tag team. You got a very confident and cocky mouthpiece in Isaiah Swerve Scott, who's insanely talented as well. And then you got the, as we said, you have to have the bodyguard enforcer type. And in this case, it's a female. And it is I'm imagining she's going to get in the ring at some point too. She's probably a performer, but they're all so excellent. They are unique when it comes to the world of factions, especially right now. They come out with a ton of swagger, and from gang signs to their poses to their there's this cocky mocking of their opponents and the back talk. It is a made for prime time gimmick these guys got right now, and I cannot wait to see where all it goes. Big ups to Hit Row and the work they're doing over on NXT right now.
And it is a bit of a DX throwback,
Yeah.
with Triple H and Road Dogg, but and Shawn Michaels all in NXT, behind the scenes now. I mean, down to the female bodyguard. You talk about the swagger, the female bodyguard, the absurdity of the female bodyguard.
Except they're also a record label. So you take like the minimum mission thing and then maybe throw in a little bit of Nation of Domination, and like they got a lot going on right now that's unique, and I'm loving it. Match of the week, Doug, I'm probably saying that what you mentioned earlier it would be mine too, but since you got that one, I have to give the call out and the kudos to the main event of last week's Hell in a Cell, Lashley and Drew McIntyre. Despite the finish, that was a little iffy. They've had a great run together. It is time for them to move on from one another. But in moving on, they probably gave the best contest the two have had together in that final match. Excellent Hell in a Cell match, and worth checking out if you happen to miss it.
Just a poor finish. Was not happy with the finish, but an excellent match.
And speaking of finish, Doug, I think we're finished.
I think we are finished, brother. I think this is the first time in a while we went past that hour. And, most of the time, well, it seems like every weekend now we're doing a pay-per-view review or a preview.
Well, Doug, you want to know what's coming up next?
What is coming up? Are we on next week? That's the 4th of July weekend, right?
We are actually off, folks, next week. Remember the 4th of July. Go enjoy some fireworks, eat some hot dogs. Take a break. We're taking a break, but when we return 2 weeks from now, July 11th, Doug, we're going to be previewing.
Oh, come on.
It is Money in the Bank in 3 weeks. So 2 weeks is our preview. 3 weeks is our review. Our preview shows do really well. So we look forward to having everyone back July 11th at 8 p.m. for our Money in the Bank preview. 2 weeks to get ready, Doug.
All right. Take care. We'll see y'all in a couple of weeks.
Later.